A man stepped forward, immediately setting the tone for what would become a tense and unusual proceeding. He identified himself not as the legal name listed in the case, but as Thomas Styron, the living man, insisting he was separate from the legal entity recognized by the court. The judge acknowledged the statement and moved forward, asking a standard question, whether he wished to be represented by an attorney. The response was equally unconventional. He claimed to be present as his own appropriate person. As the proceedings began, the judge attempted to establish order, instructing the defendant to stand properly at the podium. However, compliance did not come easily. The defendant hesitated, questioned the instruction, and subtly resisted the court's authority. The judge's patience thinned quickly. What began as a simple request escalated into a firm command. When the defendant continued to challenge the instruction rather than follow it, the judge made a decisive move, ordering him removed from the courtroom until he was prepared to cooperate. After a brief removal, the defendant was brought back in, but the tension remained. The judge proceeded with formalities, ensuring the defendant understood the seriousness of the charges. He was accused of fleeing and eluding law enforcement in the third degree, a felony offense carrying significant consequences, including potential imprisonment and financial penalties, along with the possible suspension of his driving privileges. The judge carefully outlined these risks and confirmed whether the defendant understood. The response came not as a clear acknowledgement, but as a repeated statement. He comprehended. The court then addressed the defendant's right to legal representation, explaining that an attorney could be appointed if he could not afford one. At the same time, the judge made it clear that representing oneself carries serious risks. The defendant would be expected to follow the same legal standards as a trained attorney, including adherence to procedural rules and evidentiary requirements. But instead of accepting these conditions, the defendant took a different route. He stated that he could not comply with statutory law due to his religious beliefs, claiming that such adherence violated his faith. The judge immediately dismissed this argument as irrelevant to the proceedings. The courtroom, the judge emphasized, operates under the authority of established law, not personal belief systems. Undeterred, the defendant escalated his argument further, invoking international declarations related to indigenous rights. He suggested that the court lacked jurisdiction over him, positioning himself outside the legal framework of the state. The judge responded firmly, rejecting the claim outright. This was not indigenous land, and the court's authority was clear. The laws of the state governed this proceeding, and nothing else. Despite repeated explanations, the defendant continued to express confusion and resistance. His answers grew increasingly unclear, and his refusal to acknowledge the court's authority raised serious concerns. At this point, the judge shifted focus. If the defendant could not understand the nature of the proceedings, there was a deeper issue at hand. The court made a critical decision. A competency evaluation would be ordered. The purpose was clear: to determine whether the defendant was mentally capable of understanding the charges and participating in his own defense. A forensic assessment was scheduled, along with a formal hearing set for a later date. When asked whether he would cooperate with the evaluation, the defendant's answer once again introduced conditions. He claimed he would only comply under threat, duress, and coercion. The judge rejected this framing, clarifying that cooperation must be voluntary and without such qualifications. After further questioning, the defendant ultimately agreed to participate. The court then moved to procedural matters. The prosecution was instructed to prepare the necessary documentation for the evaluation, and the defendant was informed that all notices would be sent to his recorded address. His bond conditions remained unchanged, and any motions he attempted to file would not be considered until his competency was formally established. Before closing, the judge delivered a clear and final message. Regardless of personal beliefs, ideologies, or interpretations of law, every individual in that courtroom is bound by the same legal standards. There are no exceptions. The rules of the court are not optional. They are absolute. With that, the matter was adjourned. The defendant left the courtroom still under the same bond conditions, now facing not only the original charges but also a pending evaluation that would determine whether he could even stand trial. The case would not move forward until that question was answered.